The afternoon sun blazed down on the crowded outdoor food court at Camp Pendleton, casting long shadows between the picnic tables where service members gathered during their lunch break. The California heat shimmered off the concrete, and the air was filled with the mixed aromas of grilled burgers, tacos, and the ever-present military coffee that seemed to fuel every operation on base. Sarah Mitchell sat alone at a corner table, her slight frame nearly lost in civilian clothes that seemed too big for her. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 120 pounds, she looked more like a college student than someone who had spent the last 8 years in military service. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore no makeup. To any casual observer, she appeared to be just another young woman, perhaps a contractor or civilian employee grabbing lunch on the military installation. She picked at her salad methodically, her eyes occasionally scanning the crowd with a practiced awareness that most people would never notice. Her movements were controlled and precise, each gesture economical and purposeful. Even the way she held her fork suggested years of discipline and training, though to the untrained eye, she simply looked like someone lost in thought. The 4 Marines who had been watching her from across the food court saw something entirely different. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, a thick-set man with arms like tree trunks, had been the first to notice her sitting alone. At 32, Rodriguez had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and considered himself an expert at reading people. To him, Sarah looked vulnerable, isolated, and completely out of place among the hardened military personnel surrounding her. "Look at her over there," Rodriguez muttered to his companions, nodding in Sarah's direction. "Probably some civilian contractor who thinks she can just waltz onto a military base and act like she belongs here." Corporal Danny Chen, a lean 24-year-old from San Francisco, squinted across the courtyard. "She does look pretty soft," he agreed, though something in his voice suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Chen had always been the most observant of their group, and there was something about the woman's posture that nagged at him. Lance Corporal Tony Brennan, a red-headed Irish kid from Boston who never backed down from a confrontation, was already getting worked up. "I hate when civilians come on base acting all entitled. They have no idea what real service looks like." At 22, Brennan was the youngest of the group and often the most aggressive, always eager to prove himself to his more experienced colleagues. The 4th member of their group, Sergeant Jake Williams, was quieter than the others. At 28, he had served in both Iraq and Afghanistan and had developed a reputation for being level-headed under pressure. But even Williams felt annoyed by what he perceived as civilian intrusion into their military space. "Maybe we should go introduce ourselves," he suggested, though his tone carried an edge that suggested his intentions weren't entirely friendly. The 4 Marines had formed a tight bond during their deployments overseas. They had saved each other's lives on multiple occasions, shared foxholes under enemy fire, and developed the kind of brotherhood that only comes from facing death together. This shared experience had also created a fierce protective instinct about their military community and a suspicion of outsiders who they felt hadn't earned the right to be there. As they watched Sarah continue to eat her lunch in solitude, their resentment grew. They began to construct a narrative about who she was and why she was there, each assumption building on the last until they had convinced themselves that she represented everything they disliked about civilian contractors and military dependents who they felt took advantage of military facilities without understanding the sacrifice required to maintain them. Rodriguez stood up first, his chair scraping against the concrete. "Come on, guys. Let's go have a little chat with our new friend over there." His tone was casual, but there was an unmistakable threat underneath his words. Chen hesitated for a moment, that nagging feeling in his gut growing stronger. Something about the woman's stillness bothered him, the way she seemed to be aware of everything happening around her without appearing to pay attention to anything in particular. But peer pressure and loyalty to his squad overrode his instincts, and he stood up as well. Brennan was eager to follow, cracking his knuckles as he rose from his seat. Williams brought up the rear, still feeling slightly uncomfortable about the whole situation but unwilling to abandon his brothers. As the 4 Marines began walking across the food court toward Sarah's table, other service members in the area began to take notice. Conversations grew quieter, and heads turned to watch what was developing. There was an electricity in the air, the kind of tension that builds before a storm breaks. Sarah noticed their approach long before they reached her table, though she gave no outward sign of awareness. Her peripheral vision had tracked their movement from the moment they stood up, and she had already assessed each of them as potential threats. Rodriguez was the obvious leader, probably relying on size and intimidation. Chen seemed reluctant, which suggested he might be the weak link in their group dynamic. Brennan was young and aggressive, likely to escalate quickly. Williams appeared to be the wild card, harder to read but potentially the most dangerous if things went bad. She continued eating her salad, each bite measured and calm, while simultaneously running through potential response scenarios in her mind. The picnic table offered limited mobility, with the bench seats restricting quick movement. The closest exit was about 30 feet to her left, but that would require moving past several occupied tables. The better option might be to create space by moving toward the open area near the grills, where she would have more room to maneuver if necessary. Her training had taught her to avoid confrontation whenever possible, but it had also prepared her for situations where avoidance wasn't an option. She could feel her heart rate beginning to increase slightly, her body's natural response to a potential threat, but her breathing remained steady and controlled. The four Marines were now halfway across the food court, their formation unconsciously shifting into a loose tactical spread as they approached. Other diners were definitely watching now, some beginning to move away from the area, sensing that trouble was brewing. Rodriguez was playing out the confrontation in his mind, imagining how satisfying it would be to put this civilian in her place, to make her understand that she didn't belong in their world. He envisioned her becoming flustered and intimidated, maybe even leaving the base altogether once she realized she wasn't welcome. Chen's discomfort was growing with each step. Something about the woman's complete lack of reaction to their obvious approach was unsettling. Most civilians would have at least looked up by now, shown some sign of nervousness or awareness. But she continued to sit there, calm and composed, as if four large Marines walking directly toward her was the most natural thing in the world. Brennan was practically bouncing on his toes, adrenaline already coursing through his system. He had never been good at controlling his temper, and the thought of confronting someone who he believed was disrespecting his military community had him fired up and ready for action. Williams found himself studying the woman more carefully as they got closer. There was something about the way she held herself, a quality of stillness that reminded him of the special operations personnel he had worked with overseas. But that was impossible, he told himself. She was clearly just a civilian. 20 feet away now, and Sarah finally looked up from her salad, making eye contact with Rodriguez. Her expression was neutral, neither friendly nor hostile, but there was something in her gaze that made the staff sergeant hesitate for just a moment. Her eyes were calm but alert, and there was a depth to them that suggested she had seen things most people never would. 15 feet. 10 feet. The food court had grown noticeably quieter, with conversations dropping to whispers as people sensed the approaching confrontation. Some diners had stopped eating altogether, their attention focused on the drama unfolding before them. Rodriguez reached Sarah's table first, his large frame casting a shadow over her as he stopped directly in front of her seat. Chen flanked him to the right, while Brennan and Williams positioned themselves on the left, effectively surrounding her table in a loose semicircle. "Afternoon, ma'am," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying a false politeness that barely concealed his hostility. "Mind if we join you for a minute? We'd like to have a little chat about what brings you to our base today." Sarah looked up at him calmly, taking a small sip of her water before responding. "I'm just having lunch," she said simply, her voice quiet but clear. There was no defensiveness in her tone, no indication that she felt threatened or intimidated by their presence. "Just having lunch," Brennan repeated mockingly, his Boston accent thick with contempt. "On a military base. How convenient. You got clearance to be here, sweetheart? Or are you just another civilian who thinks military facilities are your personal cafeteria?" Sarah's expression didn't change, but she set down her fork with deliberate precision and folded her hands in her lap. "I have every right to be here," she said, still speaking in that same quiet, controlled voice. Rodriguez leaned forward slightly, placing his hands on the table in what he intended to be an intimidating gesture. "Oh really? And what gives you that right? You dating some Marine who got you a visitor's pass? Because I gotta tell you, you don't look like you belong here." The insult hung in the air like a challenge, and several nearby diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some were pulling out their phones, either to record what was happening or to call for security if things escalated further. Sarah remained motionless for a long moment, her dark eyes moving slowly from Rodriguez to each of the other Marines in turn. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new edge, quiet but unmistakably dangerous. "I think you gentlemen might want to reconsider your approach," she said, her words measured and precise. "You're making assumptions that could prove embarrassing." Chen felt a chill run down his spine at her tone, but Brennan just laughed harshly. "Embarrassing? Lady, the only thing that's embarrassing is watching a civilian try to act tough in front of real Marines." Williams stepped closer to the table, his instincts finally overriding his loyalty to the group. Something was very wrong with this situation, and his combat experience was screaming warnings that his conscious mind was only beginning to process. The woman's complete lack of fear, her controlled responses, the way she seemed to be evaluating them rather than reacting to their intimidation, none of it fit the profile of a frightened civilian. But, before he could voice his concerns, Rodriguez made his fatal mistake. Growing frustrated with Sarah's calm responses and feeling his authority challenged in front of his men, he reached out and grabbed her shoulder, intending to force her to stand up and face him properly. The moment his hand made contact with her shoulder, everything changed. What happened next would be debated and discussed for years afterward by everyone who witnessed it. Sarah's response was so swift, so fluid, and so completely unexpected that most observers later claimed they hadn't even seen how it started. Rodriguez found himself on the ground before he even realized he had been moved, his arm twisted at an angle that sent shooting pain through his shoulder and elbow. Sarah was standing now, having somehow extracted herself from the picnic table bench and positioned herself in the center of the group, Rodriguez's wrist locked in a grip that felt like it could snap bone. Chen started to move toward her, but froze when he found himself looking down the barrel of what appeared to be Rodriguez's own sidearm, though he couldn't figure out how she had gotten it away from him so quickly. Brennan, always the hothead, tried to rush her from behind, but Sarah seemed to sense his approach without even turning around. A perfectly executed backward elbow strike caught him just below the ribcage, doubling him over and leaving him gasping for air on the concrete. Williams, finally, trusting his instincts, raised his hands and stepped back, recognizing skill far beyond anything he had expected. "Whoa, hold on," he called out, his voice carrying a newfound respect and wariness. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 45 seconds from the moment Rodriguez touched her shoulder to the moment she stood in the center of their group, completely in control of the situation. The food court was dead silent now, every eye focused on the small woman who had just systematically dismantled 4 combat-trained Marines with an efficiency that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Sarah looked down at Rodriguez, who was still on the ground with his arm twisted at an uncomfortable angle, his face contorted with pain and shock. Her expression remained calm, but there was steel in her voice when she spoke. "As I said, gentlemen, you were making assumptions." She released Rodriguez's wrist and smoothly returned his weapon to its holster, her movements so practiced that it was clear she had performed this action countless times before. "My name is Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, United States Navy SEALs. And you just attempted to assault a superior officer." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Rodriguez stared up at her from the ground, his mouth hanging open in shock. Shen's face had gone pale as the full implications of their mistake began to sink in. Brennan was still struggling to catch his breath, but his eyes were wide with horror as he realized what they had done. Williams was the first to recover, snapping to attention with a precision born from years of military discipline. "Ma'am, we had no idea. We thought you were." "A civilian," Sarah finished for him, her voice carrying a note of disappointment rather than anger. "Yes, I gathered that. The question is, why did that matter? Since when do Marines harass anyone on a military installation, civilian or otherwise?" She looked around at each of them, her gaze lingering on Rodriguez, who was finally struggling to his feet with Williams's help. "I've served 8 years in the Navy, including 4 years as a SEAL. I've completed 7 combat deployments and earned decorations that most of you have probably never seen. But, more importantly, I earned the right to eat lunch wherever I damn well please without being harassed by a group of Marines who forgot their own code of conduct. The crowd that had gathered around the confrontation was beginning to murmur, some people pulling out phones to record the aftermath. Sarah noticed the attention and realized that this incident was about to become much bigger than a simple misunderstanding in a food court. Rodriguez finally found his voice, though it came out as a croak. "Ma'am, we apologize. We made a mistake. A big mistake." Sarah studied him for a long moment, noting the genuine remorse in his expression. These weren't bad men, she realized. They were good Marines who had let their assumptions and prejudices cloud their judgment. It was a lesson that could benefit everyone involved, but it was also a situation that needed to be handled carefully. "Yes, you did make a mistake," she agreed. "The question now is what we're going to do about it." The aftermath of the confrontation spread through Camp Pendleton like wildfire. Within minutes, cell phone videos of Sarah Mitchell's lightning-fast takedown of Staff Sergeant Rodriguez were circulating through social media groups and military forums. The footage, shaky and incomplete as it was, captured enough of the incident to spark heated debates about military culture, gender assumptions, and the deadly effectiveness of SEAL training. Lieutenant Mitchell stood in the center of the food court, surveying the 4 Marines who had attempted to intimidate her. The crowd that had gathered maintained a respectful distance, but she could feel their eyes on her, studying every detail of her appearance and demeanor. Some whispered among themselves, trying to reconcile the small woman before them with the devastating display of combat skills they had just witnessed. Rodriguez struggled to his feet, his left arm hanging at an odd angle. The pain shooting through his shoulder was nothing compared to the humiliation burning in his chest. In his 12 years of military service, he had never been so thoroughly and efficiently neutralized. The fact that it had been accomplished by someone half his size only added to his mortification. "Ma'am," he said, his voice hoarse with embarrassment, "we need to get you medical attention. We need to get me medical attention. And, we need to report this incident through proper channels." Sarah raised an eyebrow at his suggestion. "Are you planning to file a report stating that 4 Marines attempted to assault a superior officer and were subsequently defended against?" Her tone was calm, but there was an edge of steel beneath the surface. "Because I'm curious to see how that would be received by your commanding officers." Chen stepped forward, his face flushed with shame. "Ma'am, if I may, I think what Staff Sergeant Rodriguez is trying to say is that we need to handle this situation appropriately. We were completely out of line, and we know there will be consequences for our actions." The young Marine's honesty impressed Sarah. Unlike his companions, Chen seemed to grasp the full scope of their mistake immediately. She had encountered his type before in her years of service, thoughtful soldiers who sometimes got swept up in group dynamics but ultimately possessed the integrity to own their failures. Williams, still maintaining his position at attention, cleared his throat nervously. "Lieutenant, what are your orders? How do you want to proceed with this?" It was the right question, Sarah realized. By acknowledging her authority and asking for guidance, Williams was showing the kind of military discipline that should have been displayed from the beginning. She appreciated the gesture, even if it had come too late to prevent the confrontation. Brennan, meanwhile, was still doubled over, struggling to catch his breath from the elbow strike to his solar plexus. When he finally straightened up, his face was red and his eyes watery, but he managed to gasp out an apology. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. We screwed up big time." Sarah looked around the food court, noting the dozens of people still watching their every move. Several were clearly military personnel, probably officers who would be required to report what they had witnessed. Others appeared to be civilian contractors, family members, and support staff who frequented the base facilities. The incident had attracted far too much attention to simply walk away from. "First," Sarah said, addressing all 4 Marines, "we're going to sit down and have a conversation like civilized human beings. Then, we're going to discuss how to handle the official aspects of this situation in a way that serves everyone's best interests." She gestured toward her original table, which was still set with her half-finished salad and water glass. The mundane lunch items seemed almost surreal given what had just transpired. Rodriguez, get that shoulder looked at first. "Chen, Williams, Brennan, sit down and stay put until I get back." As Rodriguez headed toward the medical station with Williams supporting him, Sarah found herself alone with Chen and Brennan. The crowd was beginning to disperse, though many people continued to glance in their direction as they returned to their own meals and conversations. Chen sat down heavily across from where Sarah had been eating, his head in his hands. "I can't believe we did that," he muttered. "I knew something felt wrong about the whole thing, but I went along with it anyway." "Why?" Sarah asked, settling back into her original seat. Her tone was curious rather than accusatory. She had learned over the years that understanding the motivations behind poor decisions was often more valuable than simply punishing them. Brennan, still breathing heavily, slumped onto the bench beside Chen. "We thought you were some civilian contractor trying to act like you belonged here," he admitted. "Rodriguez has been pissed off lately about all the non-military personnel using base facilities. He thinks it's disrespectful to people who've actually served." Sarah nodded slowly. She had encountered this attitude before in various military installations. It was a complex issue that touched on questions of earned privilege, resource allocation, and cultural identity within military communities. "And what made you think I hadn't served?" Chen looked up from his hands, meeting her eyes directly. "Honestly? You just look too... I don't know, too soft, I guess. Too civilian. We see contractors and dependents on base all the time, and they usually have this entitled attitude like they own the place. So you decided to teach me a lesson about respect," Sarah concluded. "Something like that," Brennan admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It sounds incredibly stupid when you put it like that." Sarah took a sip of her water, considering her response carefully. These Marines had made a serious error in judgment, but they seemed genuinely remorseful about their actions. More importantly, their mistake revealed deeper issues about assumptions, prejudice, and military culture that extended far beyond this single incident. "Tell me about your deployment history," she said, changing the subject slightly. "Where have you served?" Chen straightened up, grateful for the opportunity to discuss something other than their humiliating mistake. "I did 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq. Brennan here has been to Iraq twice. Rodriguez and Williams have been all over Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, some classified locations." "Combat roles?" "Infantry, mostly. Some convoy security, base perimeter defense, urban patrols. We've all seen action." There was pride in Chen's voice when he talked about their service record, despite the circumstances. Sarah nodded appreciatively. "Good service records. Commendable deployments. Which makes your behavior today even more puzzling." She leaned forward slightly, her expression growing more serious. "You're experienced combat veterans who should understand the importance of intelligence gathering, threat assessment, and avoiding unnecessary confrontations. Yet you approached a potential civilian with aggressive intent based solely on assumptions and prejudice." The criticism stung because it was accurate. Brennan shifted uncomfortably on the bench, while Chen's face flushed with renewed shame. They had violated basic principles of military professionalism and tactical thinking. "But, more than that," Sarah continued, "you forgot one of the most fundamental aspects of military culture, respect for fellow service members. Even if I had been a civilian, your behavior would have been inappropriate. The fact that I'm a commissioned officer makes it inexcusable." Rodriguez and Williams returned from the medical station, Rodriguez's arm now in a sling and his face pale from pain medication. They rejoined the group at the picnic table, completing the circle of Marines who had learned a very expensive lesson about making assumptions. "How's the shoulder?" Sarah asked with genuine concern. "Dislocated, but they popped it back in," Rodriguez replied, his voice subdued. "Doc says I'll be fine in a few weeks, but I'm on light duty until then, but..." He paused, then added quietly, "Ma'am, I want to apologize again for what happened. There's no excuse for my behavior." Sarah studied his face, noting the sincerity in his expression. Rodriguez was clearly a career Marine who took pride in his service record. Having that record tainted by such a public display of poor judgment was punishment enough, regardless of any official consequences that might follow. "Tell me about your frustrations with civilian contractors," she said, addressing the underlying issue that had sparked the confrontation. What specifically bothers you about sharing base facilities? Rodriguez glanced around the table at his fellow Marines before responding. It's not that we don't want them here, exactly. It's just that sometimes it feels like they don't understand what this place means to us. We've fought and bled for the right to wear this uniform, and when we see people who haven't made those sacrifices using our facilities, it can be frustrating. Especially when they act entitled or disrespectful, Williams added. Like they're owed something just for showing up. Sarah could understand their perspective, even if she disagreed with their actions. Military culture was built on shared sacrifice, earned respect, and collective identity. When outsiders entered that space without having undergone the same trials and tribulations, it could create tension and resentment. But here's the problem with that thinking, Sarah said, her voice taking on the tone of an instructor addressing students. You're creating an us versus them mentality based on incomplete information. You don't know who has earned the right to be here and who hasn't just by looking at them. She gestured to herself as an example. Case in point, me. You assumed I was a civilian contractor based on my appearance and decided to confront me about it. But even if I had been a contractor, what if I was a veteran who had served multiple tours before transitioning to civilian work? What if I was a military spouse who had sacrificed just as much as any service member to support our military community? The Marines exchanged uncomfortable glances, beginning to realize how many levels their assumptions had been wrong on. The point is, Sarah continued, you can't determine someone's worth or right to be somewhere based on superficial observations. And, even if you could, approaching the situation with hostility and intimidation is never the appropriate response. Chen nodded slowly. We should have just minded our own business or, if we really had concerns, reported them through proper channels. Exactly, Sarah agreed. Military discipline exists for a reason. When we start taking matters into our own hands based on personal feelings and assumptions, we undermine the entire system. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his injured shoulder reminding him of the consequences of his poor judgment. Ma'am, what happens now? Are you going to file charges against us? It was the question they had all been dreading, and Sarah could see the anxiety in their faces as they waited for her response. According to military law, what had happened constituted assault on a superior officer, which could result in court-martial, imprisonment, and the end of their military careers. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options. On one hand, the Marines had clearly violated regulations and deserved to face consequences for their actions. Their behavior had been unprofessional, inappropriate, and potentially dangerous. On the other hand, they seemed genuinely remorseful and appeared to have learned from their mistake. That depends, she finally said, on how seriously you take the lessons from today's incident. She pulled out her phone and showed them one of the videos that was already circulating on social media. The footage was grainy and shaky, but it clearly showed Rodriguez on the ground and Sarah standing over him in a position of control. This is already going viral, she explained. By tomorrow, it'll be on every military blog and news site on the internet. The story will be about 4 Marines who tried to intimidate a Navy SEAL and got their asses handed to them. Is that the legacy you want for your military careers? The Marines stared at the phone screen in horror, watching their humiliation play out in digital form for the world to see. Brennan put his head in his hands again, while Williams let out a low groan of despair. Or, Sarah continued, putting her phone away, we can turn this into something positive. A teachable moment about assumptions, respect, and military professionalism. Rodriguez looked up hopefully. What do you mean? I mean, we used this incident to start conversations about the issues that led to it. Military culture, civilian-military relations, gender assumptions, the importance of proper channels and military discipline. We turn your mistake into an opportunity to educate others and prevent similar incidents in the future. The proposal intrigued them, though they weren't entirely sure what it would entail. Williams leaned forward. What would that look like, exactly? Sarah considered the question carefully. It would mean acknowledging your mistakes publicly, participating in discussions about military culture and professionalism, and using your experience to help train other service members about appropriate behavior and threat assessment.
Like a public apology?
Chen asked.
More than that, Sarah replied. Like becoming advocates for the kind of military culture we should be promoting. Respectful, professional, disciplined, and inclusive.
The idea was beginning to take shape in her mind as she spoke. This incident, embarrassing as it was for everyone involved, could become a catalyst for broader conversations about important issues within military communities.
Rodriguez straightened up despite the pain in his shoulder.
"Ma'am, if you're willing to give us that opportunity instead of pressing charges, we'll do whatever you think is appropriate." The other Marines nodded in agreement, relief evident on their faces. They understood that they were being offered a chance at redemption rather than destruction, and they were grateful for Sarah's willingness to see potential growth in their failure.
"Good," Sarah said, standing up from the table. "Then, we have work to do."
3 days after the food court incident, Sarah Mitchell found herself in the conference room of the Camp Pendleton Public Affairs Office, staring at a whiteboard covered with media requests, interview schedules, and damage control strategies. The viral video had exploded across social media platforms, generating millions of views and sparking intense debates about military culture, gender dynamics, and civilian-military relations. Major Patricia Hayes, the base's public affairs officer, paced back and forth in front of the whiteboard, her heels clicking against the polished floor. A 20-year veteran with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun, Hayes had seen her share of public relations nightmares, but this incident had captured public attention in ways that made it particularly challenging to manage.
"The Today Show wants an interview," Hayes announced, consulting her tablet. "So does CNN, Fox News, 60 Minutes, and about 30 other news outlets. Military Times wants an exclusive. The Navy Times is demanding a statement.
And, somehow, Joe Rogan's people got hold of my direct line." Sarah sat at the conference table alongside the 4 Marines who had confronted her, all of whom looked increasingly overwhelmed by the media circus surrounding their mistake.
Rodriguez's shoulder was still in a sling, serving as a visible reminder of how quickly their assumptions had been proven wrong. "What's the official Navy position on this?" Chen asked nervously.
He had been checking social media obsessively since the incident, watching the story grow larger and more complex with each passing hour. Hayes stopped pacing and fixed him with a stern look. "The official position is that we're conducting a thorough review of the incident and will take appropriate action based on our findings. Unofficially, we have a public relations challenge that needs to be managed carefully." The truth was more complicated than Hayes was letting on. Behind closed doors, senior leadership was divided on how to handle the situation.
Some wanted to pursue disciplinary action against the Marines to demonstrate the Navy's commitment to proper conduct.
Others worried that harsh punishment would be seen as excessive given the viral nature of the video and the obvious remorse shown by the Marines involved. Sarah had spent the previous 2 days in meetings with Navy officials, explaining her perspective on the incident and her proposal to turn it into a positive learning opportunity. Her reputation as a decorated SEAL had given her significant credibility in these discussions, but she was also walking a delicate line between supporting the Marines who had confronted her and maintaining military discipline. "The bigger issue," Sarah said, addressing the room, "is that this incident has touched on some very sensitive topics that go far beyond what happened in that food court." She was right, and everyone in the room knew it. The video and subsequent discussions had sparked conversations about women in combat roles, the effectiveness of SEAL training, assumptions about physical capability based on appearance, and the broader culture within military communities. Williams, who had been quietly reviewing printouts of social media comments, looked up with a troubled expression. "Some of these responses are pretty harsh," he said. "People are calling us everything from sexist pigs to incompetent soldiers who couldn't handle a 120-pound woman." On the other hand, Brennan added, scrolling through his own phone, "There are people defending us, saying we were just doing our job protecting the base from potential threats."
Sarah shook her head at this interpretation. "That's not what you were doing, and we need to be honest about that.
You weren't conducting a security screening or following established protocols for dealing with suspicious individuals." You were harassing someone based on assumptions and prejudices. The directness of her statement made the Marines uncomfortable, but they didn't argue. They had spent the past 3 days replaying the incident in their minds, recognizing all the points where they could have made different choices. Rodriguez shifted in his chair, wincing slightly as the movement aggravated his injured shoulder. "Ma'am, we've been talking among ourselves about what you said about turning this into a teaching moment.
We want to do the right thing here. What does that look like to you?" Sarah asked.
"We think we should do the interviews," Chen said, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke. "Tell our story honestly, admit our mistakes, and talk about what we learned from the experience."
Hayes raised an eyebrow.
"That's a risky strategy.
Once you start talking to media, you lose control of the narrative. Reporters will ask tough questions, and your answers will be scrutinized by millions of people. But staying silent isn't really an option either," Williams pointed out.
"The story is out there regardless of what we do. At least this way, we can provide our perspective and, hopefully, do some good with it." Sarah appreciated their willingness to take responsibility publicly, but she also understood Hayes' concerns about media exposure. Military personnel were trained for combat, not television interviews, and the potential for misstatements or misinterpretations was high. "If we're going to do this," Sarah said, "we need to prepare thoroughly. Media training, message development, careful selection of interview opportunities. And we need to be absolutely clear about what we're trying to accomplish."
Hayes nodded reluctantly.
"What are your objectives?
What do you want people to take away from these interviews?"
Sarah stood up and walked to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. "First, we want to acknowledge the mistakes that were made and take full responsibility for them. No excuses, no justifications, just honest accountability." She wrote accountability in large letters at the top of the board. "Second, we want to educate people about the importance of challenging assumptions and avoiding stereotypes, especially in military and professional settings."
Challenge assumptions went on the board below the first point.
"Third, we want to promote better understanding between different groups within the military community: active duty personnel, veterans, contractors, family members, and support staff."
Community building joined the list.
And fourth, we want to demonstrate that mistakes can be learning opportunities if we handle them with integrity and humility. Growth from failure completed her outline.
Rodriguez studied the whiteboard thoughtfully.
"Those are good goals, but how do we make sure that's what people actually hear?
Won't they just focus on the dramatic stuff, the takedown, the embarrassment, the viral video?"
It was a valid concern, and Sarah had been wrestling with it herself. The visual impact of the video was undeniably powerful, and there was a risk that deeper messages would be overshadowed by the spectacle of the confrontation. "That's where preparation comes in," Hayes said, warming to the idea despite her initial reservations. "We craft clear, concise messages that address those themes directly.
We practice delivering them in ways that are memorable and quotable.
And we choose interview formats that allow for substantive conversation rather than just sensationalized sound bites." Chen raised his hand tentatively.
"What about the legal implications? Are we opening ourselves up to additional problems by talking about this publicly?" Hayes consulted her notes.
"The Navy's legal team has reviewed the situation. As long as you stick to factual accounts of what happened and avoid admitting to specific violations of military law, you should be protected."
Lieutenant Mitchell's decision not to press formal charges gives you some breathing room.
Sarah was pleased to hear that her choice to pursue restorative rather than punitive justice was being supported by the official review process. She had hoped that demonstrating the effectiveness of positive approaches to discipline might influence broader military policy.
"There's another consideration," Sarah added.
"This incident has generated discussions about women in combat roles and the effectiveness of SEAL training.
We need to address those topics thoughtfully without getting defensive or dismissive."
Brennan looked puzzled.
"What do you mean?"
"I mean that some people are using this incident to argue either that women don't belong in special operations, or that SEAL training creates invincible supersoldiers, or that physical size determines combat effectiveness.
All of those interpretations missed the point of what actually happened.
She moved back to the whiteboard and started a new section. What this incident actually demonstrates is that assumptions based on appearance can be dangerously misleading, that proper training can overcome physical disadvantages, and that discipline and professionalism are more important than individual combat skills. Williams nodded slowly. So we need to redirect the conversation away from gender politics and toward professional standards.
Exactly. This isn't really about men versus women or Marines versus SEALs. It's about the importance of treating people with respect and following proper procedures.
Hayes' phone buzzed with another media request, which she glanced at before setting it aside.
We're going to need to make some decisions soon about which interviews to accept. The story is moving fast, and if we don't participate in shaping the narrative, others will do it for us.
Sarah looked around the room at the 4 Marines, gauging their readiness for what would undoubtedly be an intense and challenging experience.
Public scrutiny could be more demanding than combat in some ways, requiring different kinds of courage and preparation.
Are you all committed to this approach? She asked them directly. Because once we start down this path, there's no backing out. You'll be asked hard questions about your motivations, your assumptions, and your behavior.
People will judge you based on your answers. Rodriguez answered for the group.
Ma'am, we've already been judged based on our actions. This gives us a chance to provide context and maybe do some good with our mistake.
We're ready.
The determination in his voice was echoed in the expressions of his fellow Marines. They had come to terms with their error in judgment and were prepared to face the consequences publicly if it meant turning their failure into something constructive.
Then, we need to start with media training immediately, Hayes said, making notes on her tablet. I'll set up sessions with our communications specialists. We'll practice interview techniques, message discipline, and crisis communication strategies.
Over the next several hours, they worked through potential questions and responses, identified key messages to emphasize, and developed strategies for staying on topic even when reporters tried to steer conversations toward more sensational angles. Sarah found herself impressed by the Marines' willingness to engage seriously with the process. They asked thoughtful questions about media dynamics, practiced their responses until they sounded natural, and showed genuine commitment to using their experience constructively. One more thing, Sarah said as the session wound down.
We need to be prepared for the possibility that not everyone will appreciate our approach. Some people think mistakes should be punished harshly, regardless of the circumstances.
Others might see our willingness to discuss this publicly as self-serving or attention-seeking.
Chen frowned. How do we handle that kind of criticism? With honesty and humility, Sarah replied.
We acknowledge that reasonable people can disagree about the best way to handle disciplinary issues. We explain our reasoning for choosing this approach without claiming it's the only valid option. And we stay focused on our core message about learning from mistakes and treating people with respect. As they prepared to leave the conference room, Hayes pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. This is either going to be brilliant or it's going to blow up spectacularly, Hayes said with a wry smile.
You know that, right? Sarah nodded. I know the risks.
But I also think this could be an opportunity to have conversations that need to happen anyway. Military culture is changing, and incidents like this are going to keep happening until we address the underlying issues.
And if it goes badly? If the interviews backfire or the public reaction is worse than expected? Sarah considered the question seriously. Then, we'll deal with those consequences too. But I'd rather fail trying to do something constructive than succeed at just covering up a problem. Hayes studied her for a moment, then nodded approvingly.
That's the kind of leadership thinking that got you through SEAL training.
Let's hope it works just as well with the media circus.
As Sarah left the building, she reflected on how quickly a simple lunch had turned into a complex public relations challenge with implications far beyond Camp Pendleton. The viral video had created an opportunity to influence conversations about military culture, but it had also placed enormous pressure on everyone involved to handle the situation responsibly. The real test would come in the days ahead, when they would face cameras, reporters, and public scrutiny unlike anything most of them had experienced before. Success would require the same kind of discipline, preparation, and teamwork that had served them all in their military careers, but applied to a very different kind of battlefield. 6 months after the food court incident that changed their lives, Sarah Mitchell stood before an auditorium filled with military personnel, civilians, and media representatives at the Marine Corps Base Quantico. The event, billed as leadership, accountability, and military culture in the modern era, had drawn an audience of over 800 people, including senior officers from all branches of the armed services. The transformation of the 4 Marines who had confronted her that day had been remarkable to witness. Rodriguez, his shoulder fully healed, had become an eloquent spokesperson for challenging assumptions and avoiding prejudgments in military settings. Chen had developed into a thoughtful advocate for improved communication and conflict resolution training. Williams had used his combat experience to bridge conversations between different military communities, while Brennan had channeled his aggressive energy into passionate presentations about respect and professionalism. Their journey from viral video villains to respected voices in military culture reform had not been easy. The initial media interviews had been grueling experiences, with hostile reporters and skeptical audiences questioning their motives and sincerity. But their commitment to honest accountability and genuine learning had gradually won over critics and created opportunities for meaningful dialogue. Sarah looked out over the audience, recognizing faces from various military installations, think tanks, and academic institutions. The incident that had started as an embarrassing mistake had evolved into something much larger, a catalyst for examining and improving the culture within military communities. When Staff Sergeant Rodriguez first approached my table that day, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system, he saw someone who didn't belong in his world. Someone who hadn't earned the right to share space with real warriors. What he didn't see was a fellow service member who had spent 8 years defending the same values and serving the same mission. The audience was attentive, many taking notes or recording the presentation. This wasn't the first time they had told this story, but each telling brought new insights and opportunities for deeper understanding. Rodriguez stepped forward to join Sarah at the podium. His presence was different now, more thoughtful, less aggressive, but no less confident. I made assumptions based on incomplete information and personal bias, he said, his voice steady and clear. I violated basic principles of military discipline and professional conduct. But, more than that, I failed to live up to the values I claimed to represent. The honesty in his admission still had the power to silence rooms full of experienced military personnel. In a culture that often struggled with admitting mistakes, Rodriguez's willingness to own his failures completely had become a powerful example of true leadership. Chen joined them on stage, carrying a tablet displaying social media statistics. The original video has been viewed over 50 million times across all platforms, he reported. But what's more interesting is how the conversation has evolved. Initially, most comments focused on the physical confrontation and who was right or wrong. Now, the majority of discussions center on the lessons learned and how to apply them in other situations. The data supported what they had observed anecdotally, that sustained, honest engagement with difficult topics could actually shift public discourse in positive directions. The viral moment had created an opening for deeper conversations that might not have been possible otherwise. Williams moved to a large screen that displayed testimonials from military personnel around the world. We've received thousands of messages from service members sharing their own experiences with assumptions, prejudice, and missed opportunities for connection, he said. The common theme is that people are hungry for ways to address these issues constructively. Brennan, now much more composed than the hot-headed young Marine from the food court, added his perspective. What we learned is that good people can make bad decisions when they let emotions override training and judgment. But we also learned that mistakes don't have to define us if we're willing to learn from them and do better. The presentation continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from unconscious bias training to conflict de-escalation techniques, from military-civilian relations to the importance of psychological safety in military units. The 4 Marines and Sarah had developed a comprehensive curriculum based on their experience, supported by military psychologists, leadership experts, and communication specialists. During the question and answer session that followed, a colonel from the Air Force stood up to address the panel. Lieutenant Mitchell, I'm curious about your decision not to press formal charges against these Marines. Some people have criticized the choice as being too lenient.
How do you respond to that criticism?
Sarah had fielded this question dozens of times over the past 6 months, but she still considered her response carefully each time.
Military justice serves multiple purposes, she said.
It punishes wrongdoing, it deters future violations, it maintains order and discipline, and, ideally, it helps offenders become better service members and citizens. She gestured toward the 4 Marines beside her. In this case, pursuing punitive measures would have achieved some of those goals but missed an opportunity to accomplish something more significant. By choosing restorative justice over punishment, we created space for genuine learning, public education, and cultural change that has benefited far more people than a court-martial would have. The colonel nodded thoughtfully.
But doesn't that risk sending the message that assaulting superior officers will be tolerated if the offender shows remorse afterward? Rodriguez stepped forward to address this concern.
Sir, with respect, what happened to us wasn't tolerance. It was the hardest thing we've ever been through in our military careers. Having to face public scrutiny, admit our mistakes repeatedly, and work to earn back the respect of our peers and superiors has been more challenging than any punishment could have been.
And more effective, Chen added.
Court-martial proceedings would have ended our careers, but this process has made us better Marines and better people. We've been able to use our experience to help others avoid similar mistakes. A Navy captain in the audience raised her hand.
What specific changes have you observed in military culture as a result of this initiative? Williams consulted his notes before responding.
We've seen increased enrollment in diversity and inclusion training programs, more emphasis on assumption checking and tactical decision-making courses, and greater awareness of unconscious bias in performance evaluations and promotion decisions. Sarah added, perhaps more importantly, we've seen changes in how military communities handle incidents of bias or discrimination.
Instead of just pursuing punishment, more commanders are looking for opportunities to turn mistakes into learning experiences for their entire units.
The questions continued for another 30 minutes, covering topics from implementation challenges to measurement metrics, from funding sources to expansion plans. The audience's engagement was intense and sustained, reflecting genuine interest in the practical applications of what they had learned. As the formal presentation concluded, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The food court confrontation had lasted less than a minute, but its aftermath had created ripple effects that were still spreading through military communities around the world. Rodriguez approached her as they gathered their materials from the stage.
Ma'am, I wanted to thank you again for giving us the chance to make this right.
You made it right, Sarah corrected him.
I just provided the opportunity.
You and your team did the hard work of learning from your mistakes and turning them into something positive. The post-presentation reception was held in the Officers Club, where attendees continued conversations started during the formal program. Sarah found herself in discussions with military leaders, academic researchers, and policymakers who were interested in scaling the lessons learned from their experience.
Dr.
Jennifer Walsh, a military psychologist from the Naval War College, joined Sarah at a quiet table near the back of the room. I've been following your work for the past 6 months, she said, and I'm impressed by the empirical results you've achieved.
Have you considered formalizing this approach into official military doctrine? Sarah had been wrestling with this question for weeks.
Their success had generated interest from senior military leadership about incorporating their methods into standard training and disciplinary procedures. But she was also aware that institutionalizing their approach might dilute its effectiveness or create unintended consequences. I think there's value in codifying some of these principles, Sarah replied carefully, but I'm concerned about turning what's essentially a human-centered approach into a bureaucratic process. The key to our success has been authenticity, genuine remorse, and voluntary commitment to change.
Those qualities can't be mandated through policy. Dr. Walsh nodded understandingly.
That's the eternal challenge with military culture change, how to preserve the human elements while creating systematic improvements. Perhaps the answer is to focus on training leaders to recognize when restorative approaches might be more effective than punitive ones. Across the room, Chen was engaged in an animated conversation with a group of junior officers about practical applications of assumption checking in daily military operations. His transformation from reluctant participant to passionate advocate had been one of the most rewarding aspects of the entire experience for Sarah. Williams was discussing conflict de-escalation techniques with security personnel, while Brennan was sharing his insights about channeling aggressive impulses constructively with a group of drill instructors. Each of them had found ways to contribute their unique perspectives to the broader conversation about military culture reform. As the evening wound down, the five of them gathered in a corner of the reception area to debrief from the day's events. It had become their standard practice after presentations, taking time to reflect on what had gone well and what could be improved for future engagements. The questions were more sophisticated today, Rodriguez observed. People are moving beyond the basic story and getting into implementation details, which suggests they're seriously considering how to apply these concepts in their own commands, Sarah agreed.
That's exactly what we hoped would happen.
Chen pulled out his phone to check the social media response to the presentation, which had been live-streamed to military personnel worldwide.
Early feedback looks very positive, he reported.
Lots of discussion about specific applications and requests for additional resources. Williams was already thinking ahead to their next engagement. The Army Leadership Conference is in 2 weeks, and they're expecting us to focus more on the tactical applications of assumption checking in combat situations. It was a challenging but important evolution in their work. While the original incident had occurred in a non-combat setting, the principles they had identified were highly relevant to life and death decision-making in military operations. Brennan, who had been quiet during the debriefing, finally spoke up.
You know what strikes me most about all this?
6 months ago, we were just 4 Marines who made a really stupid mistake. Now we're actually making a difference in people's lives and careers. His observation captured something essential about their journey. The viral video that had initially been a source of embarrassment and shame had become a platform for positive change that extended far beyond anything they could have imagined. Sarah looked around at the 4 Marines who had confronted her in that food court, seeing not the angry, prejudiced individuals they had been that day, but the thoughtful, committed leaders they had become. Their willingness to face their mistakes honestly and work to improve themselves had created opportunities for growth that benefited entire military communities. The real measure of our success, Sarah said, won't be how many presentations we give or how many people watch our videos. It'll be whether military personnel make better decisions when they face situations like the one we encountered that day.
Rodriguez nodded solemnly.
Every time someone chooses to gather more information instead of making assumptions, every time someone treats a stranger with respect instead of suspicion, every time someone admits a mistake and learns from it, that's our legacy. As they prepared to leave Quantico and return to their respective bases and assignments, each of them carried with them the knowledge that a simple lunch conversation had grown into something much larger than any of them had expected. The viral video would eventually be forgotten, but the conversations it had started and the changes it had inspired would continue to influence military culture for years to come. Sarah's final reflection as she drove away from the base was that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected sources. A moment of poor judgment, handled with integrity and commitment to growth, had demonstrated that mistakes could indeed become opportunities for positive change when approached with the right mindset and values. The 4 Marines who had closed in on her that day in the food court had learned that assumptions could be dangerous, respect was earned through actions rather than appearance, and true strength came from admitting failures and working to improve. But, perhaps more importantly, they had shown that redemption was possible for anyone willing to do the hard work of genuine change. Their story would continue to resonate throughout military communities, not because of the dramatic confrontation captured on video, but because of the authentic human response that followed, the willingness to take responsibility, learn from mistakes, and use those lessons to help others avoid similar failures. In the end, 45 seconds of poor judgment had created 6 months of positive change, with effects that would extend far into the future. It was a powerful reminder that how we respond to our mistakes matters more than the mistakes themselves, and that true leadership often emerges not from perfection, but from the courage to grow from our failures.